There was a chocolate shell that cracked the moment teeth broke through it, giving way to something soft and golden underneath. A sponge cake so familiar it needed no introduction, wrapped in a coating that turned an everyday treat into something that felt almost forbidden. For nearly 2 decades, that chocolate-covered cake was a fixture on the West Coast, tucked into delis and corner stores from California northward, small enough to slip into a lunch bag, but memorable enough to anchor a childhood. A crocodile-faced mascot grinned from the wrapper. Then sometime in the late 1990s, the wrapper simply stopped appearing. No press release, no farewell. Shelves that once held it quietly held something else instead, and no one ever said why. How does a company let a product this beloved disappear without ever telling anyone the reason? This is the story of a chocolate-coated cake that vanished into silence, and the people who never stopped wondering what happened to it. By 1977, the Twinkie had already become something bigger than a snack. It was a fixture in American kitchens, familiar enough that Hostess bakers in California understood exactly what it meant to the people who ate it. Soft, golden, reliably sweet. The kind of thing a kid recognized without needing to read the wrapper. But familiarity has a ceiling. Somewhere inside the company on the West Coast, where Hostess ran several of its bakeries, someone looked at that golden sponge cake and asked a simple question. What if it wore chocolate? It wasn't a radical idea. Chocolate-dipped desserts were nothing new in American bakeries. What made this different was the choice of what to dip. The Twinkie was already an icon, already loved for its texture and its filling, and taking that exact cake and coating it in chocolate meant risking the thing people already trusted. Test kitchens don't get much credit in the history of snack food, but this is where the real decision happened. Not in a boardroom, but at a table where someone bit into an early version, tasted the contrast between the crisp chocolate shell and the same soft cake underneath, and decided it worked. The filling stayed the same. The sponge stayed the same. Only the outside changed, and that was the entire point. This wasn't a new product pretending to be something else. It was the Twinkie, reintroduced through a different mouthfeel entirely. Getting the chocolate right took patience. A coating that cracked too easily fell apart in a lunch bag. A coating that stayed too soft turned greasy and lost the snap that made the first bite satisfying. Bakers were solving a problem that sounds simple and isn't. How do you wrap a delicate cream-filled sponge cake in a shell of chocolate that holds its shape on a store shelf, survives a trip in a kid's backpack, and still delivers that clean, audible crack when someone finally eats it? That balance between structure and softness is why the cake needed real engineering, not just a new recipe card. Then came the personality. A product like this needed a face, something that made it feel less like a factory item and more like a character kids could root for. That's how Chauncey Chocodile came into the world. A grinning, crocodile-shaped mascot built around the cake's own long, low silhouette. The name did double duty. It described the shape of the product and gave it an identity distinct from every other item in the Hostess lineup. Chauncey wasn't just packaging art. He showed up at public events, stood alongside other Hostess characters at fairs and promotions, and gave the Chocodile something Twinkies alone never quite had, a mascot that belonged only to this product. What Hostess produced that year wasn't positioned as a replacement for anything. It was an addition, a new way into an old favorite, built for people who already loved the original, but wanted something with a little more edge to it. The first cakes rolled off West Coast production lines without much fanfare, sold locally, stocked in delis and corner markets close to where they were made. Nobody was thinking about national distribution yet. They were thinking about getting the coating right, keeping the shape recognizable, and putting something in front of customers that tasted like the Twinkie they knew, wearing something new. It didn't take long for that local shelf presence to turn into something closer to devotion. The shelf itself told a story before anyone even picked up the package. In delis from San Diego to Sacramento, in corner markets that stocked candy near the register, the Chocodile sat among familiar names but looked like nothing else around it. The dark chocolate shell caught the eye first, glossy under fluorescent store lighting, and the shape gave it away instantly to anyone who already knew it. Two to a pack, wrapped tight, waiting for someone to toss it into a grocery bag almost as an afterthought. The kind of purchase that felt small in the moment and stuck in memory for decades afterward. For a West Coast kid growing up through the late 70s and into the 80s, finding a Chocodile in the lunch bag was its own small event. It wasn't the everyday Twinkie. It carried a little more weight, a little more anticipation, because the chocolate shell meant something different was coming before the first bite even happened. Unwrapping it meant peeling back foil or cellophane just carefully enough not to crack the coating prematurely, then biting through that thin, brittle shell into the same soft, familiar sponge underneath, the cream filling doing exactly what it always did, except now it arrived with a layer of chocolate that turned an ordinary snack into something worth trading for at the lunch table. And trading was real. Kids who had a Chocodile in their lunch held leverage. A regular Twinkie was common currency, easy to come by. Nothing special. A Chocodile was scarcer, especially the farther a family lived from the handful of Hostess bakeries producing them. That scarcity did something interesting to its reputation. It wasn't a coast-to-coast staple the way Twinkies were. It was a regional treasure, something that felt almost secret to the kids who grew up with reliable access to it, and something close to legend to relatives and pen pals living east of the Rockies who'd only ever heard about it. Chauncey Chocodile made his own rounds during these years, showing up at county fairs and public hostess promotions alongside Twinkie the Kid and the rest of the brand's cast of characters. For a child meeting that grinning, crocodile-shaped mascot in person, it cemented something that packaging alone couldn't. This wasn't just a snack. It had a face, a personality, an identity separate from every other item in the Hostess lineup. Parents who grew up in that era remember the character almost as clearly as the cake itself. Proof that Hostess understood exactly what made a product memorable to a kid. Not just the taste, but the whole experience wrapped around it. Deli owners and small grocers who carried the Chocodile learned quickly that it moved fast when it was in stock and drew disappointed questions when it wasn't. It didn't need an aisle display or an end cap to sell itself. Regular customers knew where to look, went straight for it, and bought more than one at a time when they saw it. For the sales reps and route drivers delivering Hostess products up and down the coast during these years, the Chocodile had a different rhythm than the rest of the lineup. It sold out in stores that received infrequent shipments and built a kind of loyalty that made stocking it worth the inconsistency. That inconsistency, though, was baked into the product from the very beginning, and it shaped everything about how people experienced it. Because the chocolate coating didn't hold up well over long-distance shipping, degrading and losing its snap when it traveled too far or sat too long in transit, Hostess kept production concentrated near its West Coast bakeries and rarely pushed the product into national distribution. That meant the golden years of the Chocodile played out almost entirely within a few hundred miles of the factories that made it. For the people inside that radius, it felt like a fixture, something that would always be there. For everyone outside it, the Chocodile existed mostly as a rumor, a snack cousins on vacation would bring back and describe like they tasted something rare. What made the peak years so vivid wasn't sales figures or shelf counts. It was the specificity of the memory, the particular snap of that chocolate shell, the particular relief of finding one in a lunch bag on a good day, the particular pride of being the kid who had something the rest of the class didn't. A product doesn't need to be everywhere to become beloved. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the limits placed on where you can find something are exactly what make people love it as fiercely as they do. But limits that create loyalty in one era can just as easily become liabilities in the next. What was it about a snack cake that never left the West Coast that made it feel like something worth protecting, worth remembering decades after it vanished? The very geography that gave the Chocodile its mystique, that kept it scarce and desirable and worth trading at the lunch table, was quietly setting the terms for how vulnerable it would eventually become when the company's fortunes started to shift. For most snack brands of that era, the natural next chapter was expansion. A regional hit got tested in new markets, distribution deals got signed with bigger chains, and eventually the product showed up everywhere, from Seattle to Miami. That was the playbook. It's what happened to dozens of other Hostess items, and it's what should have happened to the Chocodile too, given how fiercely people wanted it. It didn't happen, And the reason had nothing to do with demand. The problem was the chocolate itself, that glossy, brittle shell that made the first bite so satisfying was also, structurally, a liability. Chocolate coatings are sensitive to temperature swings, to humidity, to the vibration and jostling of long-haul trucking. A cake that traveled a short distance from a West Coast bakery to a nearby deli arrived intact, its shell still crisp, its surface still glossy. The same cake sent across the country in a delivery truck for days at a time told a different story by the time it reached the shelf. Heat during transit softened the coating. Temperature drops afterward caused it to bloom, turning the surface dull and streaky, sometimes even chalky to the touch. Rough handling cracked shells that were never meant to survive that kind of distance. What arrived on an East Coast shelf, on the rare occasion Hostess even attempted it, wasn't the same product that a California kid unwrapped fresh from a nearby bakery run. For a company built on national brands, this was an unusual problem to have. Twinkies traveled fine. Fruit pies traveled fine. Most of the Hostess lineup was engineered from the start with cross-country distribution in mind, built to survive warehouse storage and long truck routes without losing what made them appealing. The Chocodile wasn't built that way because it didn't need to be, not at first. It started as a regional product solving a regional appetite, and by the time it became clear how devoted its fan base was, the chocolate shell that defined it was also the exact thing standing between it and a national rollout. Hostess made the practical choice. Rather than reformulate the coating to survive distances it was never designed for, rather than risk shipping out a version of the product that arrived damaged and undercut the reputation the Chocodile had built, the company kept production close to its West Coast bakeries and let the geography set the boundaries. It was a decision that protected quality in the short term. Anyone buying a Chocodile within driving distance of a Hostess plant got the real thing. Coating intact, shape unbroken, exactly as good as it had always been. But it also meant the brand's growth stayed locked inside a radius that never significantly widened, even as word of mouth about the product spread further than the product itself ever could. That gap between reputation and availability created a strange kind of momentum. Relatives who moved east took stories about the Chocodile with them, describing a chocolate-covered Twinkie that supposedly existed but that no one outside the West Coast could actually buy. Some of those descriptions drifted into local folklore among people who'd never once seen the packaging. It gave the Chocodile an odd kind of national reputation, built almost entirely on secondhand accounts. A snack cake known more by rumor than by shelf presence outside its home territory. Inside the company, this wasn't treated as a crisis. Sales within the West Coast market stayed strong enough that there was little internal pressure to solve the shipping problem. Bakeries kept running, delis kept restocking, and the product kept selling briskly wherever it was actually available. From a quarterly numbers standpoint, there was no obvious fire to put out. But strategically, it meant the Chocodile was growing shallow roots in one region instead of the deep distributed root system that protected other Hostess products when hard times eventually came. A snack cake with a devoted regional following is a very different asset than one with a diffuse national following, and the difference matters most not during the good years, but during the years when a company starts looking for something to cut. None of that was visible yet in the moment. What was visible was a product doing exactly what it had always done, selling out fast, drawing loyal repeat customers, building a mystique that only grew stronger the longer it stayed confined to one part of the map. The Chocodile wasn't struggling. It was thriving inside a boundary nobody had drawn on purpose. A boundary built entirely out of chemistry and shipping logistics rather than strategy. And for a while, that boundary looked less like a limitation and more like exactly what made the product special in the first place. By the mid-1980s, the Chocodile had settled into something more permanent than a regional treat. It had become a fixture, the kind of product woven so completely into the rhythm of West Coast grocery runs that people stopped noticing it was there in the same way they stopped noticing familiar street signs. Parents who'd grown up trading Chocodiles at their own lunch tables in the late 70s were now the ones tossing them into their kids' lunch bags, passing down not just a snack, but a small ritual, one generation teaching the next exactly how to unwrap it without cracking the shell too early. That kind of quiet generational handoff is the clearest sign a product has moved past trend and into tradition. Nobody was advertising the Chocodile as something new or exciting anymore, because it didn't need to be. It had already earned its place. Deli owners restocked it out of habit, knowing regulars would ask for it by name. Kids who'd never lived anywhere else assumed every corner of the country had a version of this chocolate-covered cake sitting on a shelf somewhere, unaware that for most of the country, it simply didn't exist. The moment that best captured this strange mix of devotion and obscurity didn't happen at a bakery or a boardroom. It happened on television years later when the debate over what exactly a chocodile was reached a wider audience through the Food Network show Unwrapped. A taste test and a friendly argument broke out in Vacaville, California, over whether the cake underneath that chocolate shell tasted the same as the classic Twinkie people already knew. The disagreement was settled on air when a Hostess employee, Jim Duffy, confirmed what devoted fans had suspected all along. The Chocodile was, in fact, a real Twinkie, dipped in chocolate, nothing more and nothing less. It sounds like a small detail, but for fans who'd spent years insisting they could taste the difference, that on-camera confirmation validated something they already felt in their bones. The cake they loved wasn't an imitation. It was the real thing, just wearing a different coat. That single television moment did something a marketing campaign never could have. It gave outsiders, people who'd only heard secondhand stories about this chocolate-covered legend, a real glimpse of what all the fuss was about. For the first time, a national audience got to see Chauncey Chocodile's cake debated seriously, treated not as a regional curiosity, but as a genuine piece of snack food history worth investigating on camera. Inside the company, the Chocodile occupied an unusual space. It wasn't a top-line product driving national strategy meetings. It was something closer to a beloved regional workhorse, reliable, well-loved, requiring little attention because it simply worked. Sales reps covering West Coast routes knew exactly which stores to keep stocked and which corners produced the most loyal repeat buyers. Bakery workers producing the coating and assembling the cakes did so without much fanfare, turning out a product that didn't need reinvention or a new ad campaign to keep selling. In an industry where most snack items lived or died by constant reformulation and relentless marketing, the Chocodile had achieved something rare. It simply existed dependably year after year, and people kept buying it because it had always been there. That dependability is exactly what made it feel invincible. When something has been part of the landscape for over a decade, sold consistently, loved consistently, passed from parent to child without interruption, it starts to feel less like a product and more like a permanent feature of daily life. Nobody buying a Chocodile at a California deli in 1985 imagined a future where it wouldn't be there. Why would they? It had survived long enough to become part of the culture itself, immune, it seemed, to whatever forces occasionally swept away lesser snacks. But permanence is often an illusion, built entirely on the fact that nothing has gone wrong yet. What happens to a product that never had to fight for national relevance? That grew its loyalty inside a boundary rather than across an entire country. When the company behind it eventually starts looking for costs to cut and lines to simplify, the very qualities that made the Chocodile feel timeless, its narrow geography, its quiet reliability, its lack of a national safety net, were about to become exactly the vulnerabilities that put it at risk. Nobody who bought a Chocodile in 1990 thought they were witnessing the beginning of the end. That's the strange truth about slow disappearances. They rarely announce themselves. A shopper walks into the same deli she's visited for years, grabs her usual items, and doesn't notice that the shelf space for one particular product has quietly shrunk, week after week, until one day it isn't there at all. By the time anyone registers the absence, the change has already been happening for months, sometimes longer. That's roughly what happened to the Chocodile as the 1990s wore on. There was no single dramatic moment, no headline, no company statement announcing a shift in strategy. What existed instead was a slow thinning. Regulars who'd relied on their local deli restocking a familiar chocolate-covered package began noticing longer gaps between shipments. A store that once carried it reliably would run out and simply not reorder as quickly. Another store on a few towns over would quietly stop carrying it altogether. The shelf space filled instead by something else, something that didn't require the careful handling a chocolate-coated product demanded. It's worth being honest about what's known and what isn't here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where speculation can quietly replace fact. No internal memo explaining a discontinuation decision has ever surfaced publicly. No press release from Hostess or Interstate Bakeries Corporation, the company operating Hostess brands during this period, ever announced that the Chocodile was being phased out. There was no dramatic boardroom scene where an executive crossed the product off a list. What exists instead is simply the pattern of the product's own disappearance, visible only in hindsight, pieced together by the people who noticed it happening in real time and the fans who spent years afterward trying to understand why. What can be said with confidence is the structural vulnerability that had been building since the very beginning. The same shipping limitations that kept the Chocodile confined to the West Coast for its entire existence meant it never developed the kind of broad distributed sales base that protected other Hostess products during lean years. A snack sold nationally has resilience built into its footprint. If one region's sales dip, another region can absorb the loss. A snack sold only within a few hundred miles of its bakeries has no such cushion. Every dip in West Coast demand, every shift in how deli owners allocated their limited shelf space, hit the Chocodile with a directness that a national product would never have felt. And the broader business environment wasn't kind to companies like Interstate Bakeries during this stretch. The wholesale bakery industry was tightening throughout the 1990s, squeezed by rising ingredient costs, increased competition from private label snack products, and shifting consumer habits that favored newer, more heavily marketed items over legacy products that hadn't been refreshed in years. In that kind of environment, companies inevitably start asking hard questions about which products earn their shelf space and which ones survive purely on nostalgia and habit. A product with limited geography, modest overall volume compared to national bestsellers, and a chocolate coating that made it more expensive and more fragile to produce than a standard sponge cake was exactly the kind of item that could end up quietly deprioritized without ever requiring a formal announcement. Picture a deli owner outside Sacramento in 1996, someone who'd stocked Chocodiles for nearly 2 decades, watching a regular customer ask for one, and having to say, "Not this week again." He doesn't know it's the beginning of a pattern that will repeat at delis and corner stores throughout the region over the next several years. He just knows the truck didn't bring what he ordered, and he reorders anyway, assuming it's temporary. It usually was for a while, until eventually it wasn't. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from a product fading rather than being ripped away all at once. A sudden discontinuation gives people something to react to, a date to point to, a decision to be angry about. A slow fade gives people nothing but a growing absence and a lingering uncertainty about whether the thing they loved is really gone or just harder to find this month. For years, that uncertainty was exactly the experience of anyone looking for a Chocodile on the West Coast. The shelf space didn't disappear in a single visible collapse. It eroded store by store, order by order, until sometime around the end of the decade, it simply wasn't showing up anywhere at all. How long can a company quietly let a product fade before the silence itself becomes a story? For the people who grew up on the Chocodile, that silence would end up defining the loss almost as much as the disappearance itself, because there was never an explanation to hold on to, only the absence and the slow realization that no answer was ever coming. Interstate Bakeries Corporation, the company operating Hostess brands through the 1990s, wasn't hiding some secret plan to kill the Chocodile. What it was managing publicly and documented in its own financial filings over the following years was a company under mounting strain. Rising flour and sugar costs squeezed margins across its entire product line. Competition from private label snack cakes, sold cheaper and requiring none of the brand loyalty Hostess had spent decades building, chipped away at shelf space in supermarkets nationwide. Consumer habits were shifting too, with a generation of shoppers increasingly drawn to newer snack categories and away from the legacy cake aisle that had defined American grocery stores for half a century. None of this was specific to the Chocodile. It was the environment the entire company operated in the years leading up to its eventual 2004 bankruptcy filing, a filing that came a few years after the Chocodile had already faded from West Coast shelves, but one that makes clear just how much financial pressure had been building throughout the preceding decade. Inside that pressure, individual products don't get executed in dramatic boardroom scenes. They get quietly reviewed against cost sheets, production complexity, and regional sales volume. And the ones that don't clear the bar simply stop getting reordered. This is where the Chocodile's specific vulnerabilities mattered most. It was by design more expensive to produce than a standard Hostess item. The chocolate coating required its own processing step, its own quality controls, its own sensitivity to temperature during storage and transport. A company looking to simplify operations and cut costs during a period of financial strain doesn't need a dramatic reason to deprioritize a product like that. It only needs a spreadsheet showing that the Chocodile's limited single-region sales volume didn't justify the extra complexity of producing it, especially when compared to items that could be baked, shipped, and sold nationwide with far less specialized handling. It's important to be precise about what is documented here and what isn't, because this is exactly the kind of story where it becomes tempting to invent a villain. No internal memo laying out a specific decision to discontinue the Chocodile has ever surfaced. No former Hostess executive has gone on record describing a meeting where the product was formally cut. What exists instead is the visible outcome, a product that quietly stopped being reordered by distributors, that gradually vanished from delis and corner stores throughout the late 1990s, produced by a company that was simultaneously cutting costs, closing inefficient lines, and consolidating its operations in preparation for the larger financial reckoning that would arrive with its 2004 bankruptcy filing. The Chocodile's disappearance fits a pattern common to companies under this kind of strain, where smaller, costlier, regionally limited products are often the first casualties of belt tightening. Not because anyone hates them, but because they're the easiest line items to remove without triggering a company-wide reaction. For the people actually making the product, the experience was less abstract than a balance sheet. Bakery workers at the West Coast plants producing Chocodiles didn't need a memo to understand what declining order volume meant. Route drivers delivering to delis and corner stores felt it directly, watching their delivery lists shrink as fewer accounts kept the product on their regular orders. A Route sales rep who'd spent years building relationships with store owners specifically around the Chocodile, coaching them on how to display it, how to handle the delicate coating during unloading, watched that specialized knowledge become less and less useful as fewer stops actually wanted the product anymore. There's a particular kind of quiet defeat in watching something you helped build fade, not because customers stopped wanting it, but because the company decided it wasn't worth the trouble of keeping it available. And customers, for their part, never stopped wanting it. That's part of what makes this chapter difficult to tell as a simple story of changing tastes. This wasn't a product that lost its audience. Every account from deli owners and longtime customers describes the same pattern. Steady demand, loyal repeat buyers, shelves that emptied quickly whenever stock actually arrived. What failed wasn't consumer interest. It was the business logic surrounding a product that cost more to make, traveled poorly, and generated revenue confined to a single region during a period when the company needed to simplify everything it could. In a healthier financial environment, a beloved regional product with steady demand might have survived indefinitely on loyalty alone. Under the pressure interstate bakeries was facing throughout the 1990s, loyalty wasn't enough to offset the extra cost and complexity of keeping it in production. There's no confirmed moment when insiders at the company understood that the Chocodile was finished. If such a moment existed in a meeting or a memo, it has never become public record. What can be said is that by the time anyone outside the company registered the pattern, by the time shoppers and deli owners started openly wondering out loud whether the product was really gone for good, the decision, whatever form it actually took inside interstate bakeries, had already been made. The company never announced it, never explained it, and never gave the people who loved this product the closure of an official goodbye. And who exactly was supposed to protect a product like this? One that never had the national sales volume to earn a place at the center of corporate strategy. But that meant everything to the people who grew up on it. The Chocodile wasn't killed by a single villain or a single decision that anyone can point to with certainty. It was worn down by the ordinary, undramatic math of a company managing decline. Math that rarely accounts for the specific memory of a chocolate shell cracking open in a kid's hands, or the particular loyalty of a deli owner who kept reordering long after it stopped making financial sense to do so. By the time the 1990s came to a close, there was no single day anyone could point to and say that was the day the Chocodile died. There was no press release, no farewell tour, no final flavor announcement the way some discontinued products get. What there was instead was an accumulation of small absences that eventually added up to something final, though nobody experienced it that way in the moment. Consider the deli owner outside Sacramento who had been placing the same standing order for Chocodiles for the better part of 2 decades. Sometime in 1998 or thereabouts, the exact year lost to memory the way most quiet endings are, his distributor stopped being able to fill that part of the order, not canceled outright, just unavailable. He assumed, as he had during earlier gaps throughout the decade, that it was temporary, a production hiccup, a supply chain issue that would resolve itself within a few weeks. He kept the order on the books, he kept asking. Eventually, he stopped asking, not because he made a decision to give up, but because there's only so many times a distributor can tell you a product isn't coming before you quietly remove it from your own ordering sheet and move on to something that will actually show up on the truck. That pattern repeated itself, store by store, across the handful of West Coast counties that had ever reliably carried the product. There was no coordinated announcement telling every deli and corner market to expect the same thing at the same time. It happened unevenly, which made it even harder for anyone to recognize as a real ending rather than a temporary supply problem. One store in San Jose might still have had a few packages left on the shelf in early 1999, while a store 40 miles away had already gone 8 months without seeing a single delivery. Regular customers experienced this as confusion more than grief at first. They'd ask a store clerk, and the clerk genuinely didn't know either. Sometimes they'd say check back next week. Next week rarely helped. What makes this kind of disappearance particularly hard to trace, and particularly hard on the people living through it, is the complete absence of an official record marking the end. No discontinuation notice was filed publicly. No Hostess spokesperson gave an interview explaining the decision. Newspaper archives from the late 1990s and early 2000s, the kind of local business coverage that sometimes captured smaller product discontinuations, show no mention of the Chocodile's exit at all. It simply isn't there. In the same way the product itself simply stopped being there on the shelves. The absence of documentation isn't an oversight in the historical record. It's a reflection of how genuinely unremarkable this must have looked from inside the company at the time. One regional item among hundreds in a portfolio, quietly deprioritized during a period when interstate bakeries had far larger financial problems commanding its attention. For the people who'd grown up on it, though, the lack of an official ending created its own particular kind of unresolved loss. There was no moment to point to, no company statement to be angry at, nothing to organize a protest around, even if anyone had thought to try. What existed instead was a slowly dawning realization, different for every individual family, that the chocolate-covered Twinkie they used to find without even thinking about it simply wasn't showing up anymore, and increasingly wasn't going to. A parent who'd bought them for their own kids throughout the mid-1990s might not have registered the full stop until sometime in 2000 or 2001, when a routine trip to the store for one finally forced the question, has this been gone for a while now? When exactly did that happen? This is where the story fully splits along geographic lines that had defined the Chocodile from the very beginning. For most of the country, there was no loss to register at all because there had never been access to lose. East Coast consumers who'd only ever heard secondhand stories about this chocolate-covered legend continued not having it exactly as before. It was West Coast families, the ones who'd built decades of small rituals around it, who felt the specific shape of this absence. And even among them, the experience wasn't uniform. Someone living in the immediate radius of a Hostess bakery might have had a slightly longer window of availability than someone 30 miles further out. where distribution had always been thinner to begin with. The ending, in other words, arrived on a rolling schedule with no clear finish line, which is part of why so many fans, even decades later, struggled to name an exact year when they knew for certain it was over. What followed wasn't a single wave of public mourning, but something slower and more scattered. The kind of grief that builds gradually across message boards and word of mouth, rather than erupting all at once. Through the early 2000s, as internet forums and early online communities started giving scattered fans a place to actually find each other, something interesting happened. People who'd spent years individually wondering whether they'd imagined the whole thing discovered they weren't alone. A chocolate-covered Twinkie with a crocodile mascot, gone without explanation, turned out to be a shared memory held by thousands of people scattered across California, Oregon, Washington, and the pockets of relatives elsewhere who'd tasted one on a childhood visit west and never forgotten it. Online nostalgia communities built entirely around the memory of the Chocodile began forming in the years that followed, trading descriptions of the exact taste, comparing notes on which stores had carried it longest, and asking the same unanswered question in slightly different words. Why did this disappear, and is there any chance it's coming back? Without an official reason to point to, speculation filled the gap the way it always does. Some fans assumed a formula problem. Others assumed simple corporate indifference. Nobody had confirmation either way, and that uncertainty became its own part of the folklore surrounding the product, a mystery that fans kept alive precisely because no company statement had ever closed the door on it. Secondary markets responded to that hunger in the most predictable way possible. As word spread that the product was genuinely gone, rather than just hard to find, remaining sealed packages that had been sitting forgotten in pantries or back stockrooms started appearing for sale online, priced far beyond what anyone had ever paid at a deli counter. A two-pack that once cost pocket change became, to a dedicated collector, worth considerably more, treated less as a snack and more as an artifact of a specific childhood. This wasn't a coordinated campaign or an organized petition drive in the way some discontinued products generate. It was quieter than that, driven by individual fans who simply refused to fully let go. Some of them reaching out directly to Hostess over the years, asking, sometimes pleading, for the product's return. The factory workers and route drivers who had once made and delivered the Chocodile mostly moved on to other products within the same West Coast bakeries, since Interstate Bakeries continued producing the rest of its Hostess lineup throughout this period. There's no record of layoffs specifically tied to the Chocodile's disappearance, in part because it was never a large enough product line to require its own dedicated production shift. Its exit was absorbed quietly into the broader operations of bakeries that kept running, making Twinkies and other snack cakes for a national market that had never depended on this one regional item in the first place. The loss, in other words, barely registered on the company's books. It registered almost entirely in the memories of the people who used to eat it. That imbalance, a product that meant almost nothing to the company's bottom line and everything to the people who grew up on it, is what made the Chocodile's disappearance feel so strange to the fans left behind. There was no factory closure to mourn, no worker testimony about watching a beloved product get cut. There was only an absence, unexplained and apparently unremarkable from the inside, that turned out to matter enormously from the outside. For nearly 15 years, that absence simply persisted, an open question nobody at Hostess seemed inclined to answer, and a hole on West Coast shelves that an entire generation had quietly learned to live around. What does it mean when a company can let something this loved disappear so completely that even people looking for an explanation can't find one? For the fans who kept the memory alive through those long, silent years, the not knowing became almost as much a part of the story as the cake itself, a mystery with no ending, waiting for someone, someday, to either explain it or bring it back. In 2014, after nearly 15 years of silence, Hostess ended the question fans had been asking for over a decade. The Chocodile was coming back, and this time, the company wasn't treating it as a quiet regional item slipped back onto a few West Coast shelves. It was announced as a permanent part of the Hostess family, a deliberate public reversal of whatever quiet decision had let the product fade away in the first place. The relaunch came with new variety flavors that hadn't existed in the original run: strawberry creme, chocolate creme, and banana creme, an expansion that suggested Hostess wanted this version to feel like more than a simple nostalgia play. It wanted it to feel like a real product line with room to grow. For the fans who'd spent years trading memories in online forums, hunting down aging sealed packages at inflated prices, and wondering if anyone at the company even remembered the product existed, the announcement landed as vindication. Here finally was proof that the demand had been real all along, that the online communities and the message board threads and the decade of unanswered questions had actually been heard by someone with the authority to do something about it. Early coverage of the relaunch captured that same disbelief, describing it in terms usually reserved for a genuine return from the dead, a snack cake resurrected after fans had largely given up hope. The revival, though, told its own story about what had actually gone wrong the first time. This new version acknowledged, without ever saying so explicitly, that a product confined to a narrow shipping radius couldn't survive as a permanent national brand. Rather than replicate the original's fragile, poorly traveling chocolate shell exactly as it had existed in the 1970s and 80s, the relaunched Chocodile was built for wider distribution from the start, a tacit admission that the very geography-bound charm that made the original so beloved by West Coast fans was also the flaw that had made it so easy to quietly cut decades earlier. That tension never fully resolved. The 2014 version found an audience, but it wasn't the same audience experiencing the same product in the same way. Longtime fans who'd built their memories around a specific regional scarcity now found the Chocodile sitting in stores far outside California for the first time in its history, available to people who'd never once had to search for it. For some original fans, this felt like a genuine gift, finally sharing something they loved with friends and family who'd only ever heard the legend. For others, something about wide availability changed the character of the product itself, turning a scarce, almost secret treasure into something ordinary. And ordinary was never quite what people had been mourning. By 2017, the name itself had changed. The product was rebranded as Fudge-Covered Twinkies, a more literal, more mainstream label that traded the personality of the Chocodile name, and by extension, the ghost of Chauncey Chocodile himself, for something that read more like straightforward packaging copy than a character with any history behind it. That rebrand didn't sit well with fans who'd fought for over a decade to see this specific product under its specific name come back. Something had been returned, but it wasn't quite the same thing that had disappeared. Eventually, that version disappeared too, joining a small, strange lineage of relaunches and rebrands that never quite recaptured whatever balance the original had struck between regional scarcity and genuine devotion. What the Chocodile's history reveals, more than almost any other lost product, is how a company can misjudge exactly what made something valuable in the first place. Hostess brought back the taste. It brought back a version of the shape and the name. What it couldn't manufacture back into existence was the specific geography-bound rarity that had made finding one feel like something worth trading for at a lunch table decades earlier. The broader lesson sits uncomfortably close to home for anyone who's ever watched a beloved local business get bought out and scaled into something unrecognizable. Sometimes the very limitation that seems like a weakness on a balance sheet is actually the thing keeping a product's soul intact, and removing that limitation to chase wider sales can accidentally remove the soul along with it. For the California and Pacific Northwest communities where Hostess bakeries had operated for decades, the Chocodile's story, discontinuation, revival, and eventual rebrand mirrors a broader pattern that played out across American manufacturing throughout the same period. A regional specialty, born from real production constraints, eventually flattened by a national market that has little patience for products that can't scale efficiently. What does it mean that the very qualities that make a local product feel irreplaceable are so often the first thing sacrificed when a company tries to bring it back on a larger stage? There was a particular sound to opening a Chocodile, a small percussion of foil giving way, and then the shell itself, that thin, dark, glossy coating, cracking clean under the pressure of a thumb or the edge of a bite, the sound arriving a half second before the taste did. Underneath, always the same soft give, the sponge yielding easily, the cream filling meeting the tongue with that familiar sweetness that had nothing to prove because it had already proven itself 1,000 times before. The chocolate came first, faintly bitter against the sugar waiting underneath it, and then everything blended into the specific, unmistakable flavor that a generation of West Coast kids could still describe in exact detail decades after the last one ever left a shelf. It was never a complicated taste. It didn't need to be. It only needed to be exactly the same every single time, and for nearly 20 years it was. What made that consistency matter wasn't the cake itself, but everything wrapped around it. A lunch bag on a good day, a deli counter where the clerk knew you by name and set one aside when a new shipment came in, a county fair where a grinning, crocodile-shaped mascot pressed his cartoon hand into yours and made a snack cake feel, for a moment, like a character in your own life rather than a product on a shelf. None of that was really about chocolate or sponge cake or cream filling. It was about the particular rhythm of growing up somewhere specific, in a specific decade, where this one thing was simply part of the landscape, as ordinary and as irreplaceable as a familiar street or a grandparent's kitchen. The Chocodile never asked to be anyone's favorite food. It became something people built small rituals around anyway, the way people always do with the things that show up reliably during childhood and then quietly vanish before anyone thinks to say goodbye. That's the part we're sitting with, not the chemistry of a chocolate shell that couldn't survive a cross-country truck route, not the balance sheets of a company managing decline, not even the strange, unresolved mystery of exactly when or why the reordering finally stopped. What's worth sitting with is what a product like this actually provided, which was never really about the ingredients. It was about being handed something familiar by someone who loved you, without either of you having to say so out loud. It was about the specific pride of having something scarce enough to be worth trading and generous enough to still be worth sharing. It was about a mascot with a silly name who made a Tuesday afternoon snack feel, briefly, like it belonged to a story bigger than itself. No relaunch, no rebrand, no new flavor variety ever quite managed to bring that particular combination back, because that combination was never really a recipe. It was a childhood held together by chocolate and sponge cake and a crocodile with a grin that meant nothing and everything at once. The bakers who first got that coating right in a California test kitchen in 1977 are owed something here, even if their names were never widely recorded. So are the route drivers who learned exactly how to handle a fragile chocolate shell without cracking it during unloading, and the deli owners who kept reordering long after it stopped making obvious financial sense, simply because their regulars kept asking. So are the parents who bought them without a second thought, and the kids who ate them without ever imagining a version of the world where they'd someday have to explain to their own children what a chocodile even was. None of them set out to build something people would still be mourning 40 years later. They were just trying to make something good, and for a while, on a stretch of coastline most of the country never saw, they did exactly that. It's tempting, looking back, to want someone to blame. A villain, a single bad decision, a moment where someone in a boardroom chose profit over people. The truth is quieter and, in its own way, sadder than that. Nobody killed the Chocodile. It simply stopped being reordered, one deli at a time, inside a company managing larger problems than one regional snack cake, until the absence became permanent without anyone ever having to make it official. That kind of ending doesn't offer closure. It offers only the memory, sharpened rather than dulled by the passage of time, of exactly what was lost. Somewhere tonight, someone who grew up on the West Coast in the late 70s or through the 80s is trying to describe that taste to someone younger, struggling to explain why a discontinued snack cake still means enough to bring up decades later. They probably won't get the description quite right. It's hard to translate a sound like that shell cracking, or a specific mix of chocolate and cream, into words precise enough to make someone else taste it too. But the trying matters anyway because it means the memory is still alive, still being carried forward by the people who were there, Still worth keeping even now that the shelf where it once sat has long since filled with something else entirely.